And the Tiemann Show continues with Isaac Tiemann's making a guest appearance. The question is, are the Western democracies incapable of waging war to win? No, but first of all, the Western democracies are pretty new. There really hasn't been a Western democracy club since really the end of World War II. And it's a funny coincidence because I've said a few times in the past, since the end of World War II, we've been involved in any number of police actions, but we've certainly been involved in a few major hot shooting wars. We've been involved in Korea. We were involved in Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and obviously adventures in Panama and Grenada and God knows where. But we've been at war several times since the end of World War II. But as I've said many times before, the world has not seen America all the way angry since August 9th of 1945. That's the last time the world saw America really angry. And we haven't been angry since. We talked, I think, in a previous episode about how different the world would have been if they'd used nuclear weapons against the Chinese in Korea. How many lives that would have saved over time. Millions of lives would have been saved if they'd used some nuclear weapons on those Chinese military formations coming to the aid of North Korea. Because if they had done that, they would have basically stopped this socialist guerrilla power grab that took place in Korea and Vietnam and South America and all these places. It would have made it clear that Western democracies, the idea of republic and freedom, meant something to us, and we were ready to fight for it and fight for it with everything we had. But we haven't been angry or all the way at war since August 9th of 1945. And we know this to be true. The question is, can those kind of wars be fought again? I don't know. 9/11 is an interesting example. I happen to think, personally, that our response to 9/11 was actually pretty appropriate. Some people disagree with me, but I think it was pretty appropriate. Osama bin Laden, it's not my opinion, it's not what I think he said. This is not my Harvard faculty law lounge opinion. This is what Osama bin Laden said to his other people in multiple communications. He said he thought America was a paper tiger, that they defeated the Soviets, who were much tougher than us, and that all he had to do was hit us just a little bit, and we would collapse like a paper tiger. He said his people wanted to be behind the strong horse. He thought that Al-Qaeda were the strong horse because they were savage and brutal, and like everybody else who've ever looked at America as an enemy, thought we were weak and stupid and fat. We may have been stupid and fat. But in history, a few times, they've made that calculation, and then we've gotten angry. And when we get angry, we're not weak at all. And we're suddenly not stupid, and we're suddenly not fat. And they never learn, and we never learn. So it seems to me that the cycle of the Western democracies with regard to war is this. The Western democracies, because of their capitalist intentions, their strong understanding of science and engineering principles, and their self-correcting mechanism, at least presumably, of democracy with individual rights protected by a republic, generate enormous amounts of wealth. That wealth is visible to the rest of the world, and that wealth gives the people who live in these countries a sense of ease and comfort and an unwillingness to risk things. This is all perfectly understandable to me. We're not going to go to war over little things because we got too much to lose. This model, there's a intellectual game. Sometimes these little thought experiments help clarify more complex issues. And the one that I think applies to us is if you have a car in one lane and it's a brand new Mercedes-Benz, and in the second lane over, you've got a 1978 Pinto, and both cars are going to try and merge into that middle lane, and they both see each other merging. Who do you think's going to blink? Who do you think's at the last second going to swerve away if both of those guys want that lane? Well, the argument is that It's going to be the Mercedes that's going to swerve because the Pinto has got so many dings and scratches and dents on it already. Another dent's nothing to him. He's got nothing to lose. The Mercedes, on the other hand, is immaculate. He's not going to get this perfectly beautiful car dinged or scratched up for some Pinto, and if he does, it's going to cost him a fortune to get it fixed. And that's kind of the calculation that these savages make with us. They know they're driving a beat-up old clunker. They know that we're driving a brand-new Mercedes, and they assume that if it becomes head-to-head kind of, one or the other of us is going to move into this middle ground, they think we're going to blink. And generally speaking, they're right. Generally speaking, they're right. We do blink because we do have more to lose. But every now and then, they do something that makes it clear to us that if we don't act, we're going to lose the Mercedes and we're going to end up with a piece of crap clunker just like them. And when that happens, then the great Western, especially American, psychological transformation takes place. And once again, our enemies stand in dumbfounded awe at the gigantic, horrific mistake they made. It's not just bin Laden. The Japanese made precisely the same calculation that bin Laden made, and they made it in the late 1930s. They looked at America. They said America's prosperous. America's fat, decadent, weak. They don't have the warrior spirit that we have. They don't have the willingness to go to war. They're soft, unserious, jazz age party people. They'll never, ever, ever have the kind of fighting spirit that we have. They're never going to want to take the kind of losses that we're prepared to take. And so, therefore, if we sink their fleet in Pearl Harbor with one stroke, they would rise up to defend America. There's no question about that, but the Japanese never wanted to do that. The Japanese figured if they sank our fleet at Pearl Harbor, then we would basically surrender the Pacific. And really all the Japanese wanted was the Western Pacific. They figured maybe America might fight for Hawaii, but they certainly aren't going to fight for Singapore, or they're not going to fight for the Marianas or any of that stuff. So they thought we were weak and stupid and had too much to lose, and we were driving that Mercedes. So if they sank our fleet at Pearl Harbor, we'd just call it a day. But they didn't understand what happens when you scratch the paint on the Mercedes. It pisses us off quite a lot. So bin Laden made that miscalculation, and the Imperial High Command, Tojo military clique, made that miscalculation. And World War I's a little muddy, but you can also basically even go to the Civil War. And I know a lot of people have different views about the Civil War and who was the right side on the Civil War and states' rights and everything and the giant federal government. Put all that aside for a second. When the South decided to secede, their vision of the North was a nation of greasy mechanics and mudsills. They thought that Northern people were indoor people, that they were weak, inbred, pale, sick, and that the Southern man who spent his entire life outdoors in the field on horses, because that's what soldiering was in those days, was worth 10 or 50 or 100 Yankees. So the hot-blooded, the fire eaters took the Confederacy to war against the Union. And people who understood the psychology of the Union, the difference between really hot-headed South Carolinians and staid, quiet Pennsylvania Lutherans, they understood that the difference between these two was that the South was a piece of flash paper where you would put a torch to it and it would go up in a brilliant flash of energy and rhetoric and passion, but that the North was a boiler. It was a giant boiler filled with cold water, and that you had to light a fire under it, and that fire had to burn for a year or two. But once that fire started burning, it wasn't going to go out. And once that fire was lit, no matter how long it took to get that water heated up, it was not going to stop. And that boiler, once lit, was going to produce so much steam energy that nothing could stand in its way. And many people in the North understood that about the Northern people. That's why the North was slow to get into the war. That's why the U.S. was slow to get into World War II and slow to start winning World War II. All this stuff is the same pattern. It's like we are so fundamentally peaceful and averse to war. This is why the great slander against America as being a warlike country is absurd. I hung out and still hang out among conservatives and hawks and soldiers and former generals. I hang out with defense contractors. I talk with special forces guys all the time. I talk with guys in the intelligence community. I talk with all of the people who are on the sharp, pointy end of the American spear. And I can tell you, I've been doing this for 15, 20 years. I wanted to be one of them. And I'm telling you that I have never, ever, 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 ever heard any one of them so much as hint around the edges of wanting to go conquer another country for territory or resources, period, full stop, end of sentence. I've never, ever, ever, ever heard it. And why should we? We live in paradise. What the hell would we want with Djibouti or Saudi Arabia or France, for that matter? Honestly, we just don't have any interest in it. We don't want it. We live in paradise, and all of the stuff we do is to defend this idea. So the Western democracies are very slow to war. So the question is there a world where America, so I can't answer for the Western democracies in Europe, I suspect that they won't fight for anything ever. I think they are, in fact, so R-selected. They're so better read than dead. You want an R psychology slogan, better read than dead is as good as you get. They'd rather be communists than free, than risk dying. They'd rather be free. But if it came down to dying or risk dying versus being communist, they'd be communists. If it came down to being Muslims or risk dying for freedom, they'd be Muslims. I think they're utterly inbred, passive, weak, submissive people. So the question is, what would get America fighting? Would a nuclear attack on New York City do it? 9/11 was fairly close to a nuclear attack, in terms of the number of, the amount of energy released. It's certainly, if they hadn't evacuated those towers, it would have been 30,000 killed instead of, 3,000 killed. I don't know. I don't know. I think if a nuclear bomb went off in Times Square, speaking for myself as president, if a nuclear weapon goes off on American soil, then many nuclear weapons are going to go off someplace else. That's just going to happen. And I don't care if it's a tent. If I found out that a nuclear bomb was detonated in Times Square and that the people that did it were two people living in a tent in the Sahara, they'd get the biggest bomb I had, and they'd get 10 of them. I'd put 10 nuclear weapons over that tent, and they can experience the bright white light of freedom themselves. So I don't know what happens. I don't know. What would cause the Western democracies to fight? I think the only answer to that question is, Isaac, is it has to be perceived as the end of all of this abundance and security. We have to understand that if we don't fight, then we're going to lose it. And frankly, I don't know. I thought the response to 9/11 was appropriate. Osama bin Laden calculated that if he hit us hard enough, we'd surrender. The cost to that decision was not just his life, a far too small a price to get in exchange for the number of people that died and what we lost. What that decision cost the Islamic Caliphate was two countries. It cost them two countries. It cost them control of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and it cost them Iraq. We took two countries off the board. That's what we did. And Al-Qaeda was an operationally functional, extremely deadly fighting force on September 10th. But after September 11th, the number of recruits that rallied to Al-Qaeda because of this big victory over the Great Satan was enormous. There were hundreds of thousands of dedicated terrorists ready to come to America and do what they'd done on 9/11. And we didn't fight them at Disneyland, and we didn't fight them at the mall. We killed them in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's where they are. They're buried in the sands of Iraq and Afghanistan. They're dead over there instead of over here because of the 4,000 people we lost in Iraq and the 3,000 or 4,000 people we're losing in Afghanistan. Our soldiers are fighting their soldiers instead of their soldiers killing our civilians. That's the way it should be. That's why I back the military. That's why we have a military. But this is not America fully angry. I don't know. I think the only way I can really answer your question for you is to say, Isaac, that there is a Western democracy that I think is capable of waging a war to win, and that is Israel. There's fairly widely known, Operation Samson? The Israelis probably have 500 nuclear weapons. They may have more nuclear weapons than we do, frankly. They've got hundreds of them anyway. And I think it's fairly widely known to the people that are trying to drive Israel into the sea that the Israeli position is, we can't stop you from being driven into the sea. We don't have that many people. Our country's the size of, LA County. But before we're driven into the sea, every country allied against us is going to turn to dust. I admire that so much, that clarity, that absolute clarity, that moral clarity, that willingness to say, this society, this religion, this people, this culture, so horribly outnumbered, you will not win. You can defeat us, but you will not win. We will eliminate you from the face of the earth. Israel has that kind of willpower. We do too. I just can't imagine a threat of that magnitude, frankly. If there were nuclear weapons detonated in an American city, I think the President of the United States, even this one, would have to respond with a nuclear response, and if he didn't, he'd be chased out of the White House with torches and dogs. So I don't know. I have a horrible feeling we're going to get a chance to find out. I don't think there's much question that I am not going to live to see a nuclear exchange. I don't think it's going to be over American cities, and I don't think it's going to be American weapons, but I think we're going to see nuclear weapons deployed in this earth, and we're gonna have iPhone footage of mushroom clouds in the aftermath. I just don't know where it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be here. I should just say parenthetically, when you think about the threats to our cities with bombs that are smuggled in on freighters, or this idea of a suitcase nuke doesn't actually exist, but certainly deliverable nuclear weapons to the United States. I should just say, for your own peace of mind, that I don't have a security clearance, and if I did, I wouldn't be talking about this. But since I don't, I can speculate. I do know that the sensitivity of our detection apparatus is absolutely astonishing. If a container with a warhead sailed 1,000 miles off the tip of the Cape of Good Hope, we'd know about it. It's remarkable. And that gives me some peace of mind. I wish the intelligence services were more focused on threats to the country from outside and a little less worried about what American citizens are saying to each other. Let's move on.